for Russia and Ukraine, and ambassador to Ukraine. Stephen Pfeiffer is now an affiliate of the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation and a non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution. Stephen served as a special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council.
Let me first ask, can anybody hear me? So can you all hear me back there?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this without the microphone just because I sometimes like to talk through my hands and I don't want to throw this microphone at someone.
It's their microphone. We don't want to pay for it.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, Sharon, thank you very much for the introduction. Look, 30 years ago, there were really high hopes that we could build a cooperative relationship between the United States and Russia and between the Western Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed. And sadly, those hopes have not been realized. The U.S.-Russia relationship today is as low as it's been in decades, and I would have to say the same about the broader Western relationship with Russia. I'm not going to lay all the blame on the Russians. I think that Washington has made mistakes over the past 30 years. But I do believe that the bulk of responsibility does lie with Moscow and Vladimir Putin. Now, when he first became president in 2000, president of Russia, I think Putin wanted to have a relationship with the United States and the West. But he wanted to have the relationship on his terms. And I don't think that the West could accept or should have accepted those terms. And now when we look at Russia and Vladimir Putin, I think we see major challenges. And so I'll go through those briefly. First of all, I think the biggest challenge that Putin presents today is in Europe. The war that we've seen now between Russia and Ukraine is the largest, bloodiest war in Europe since World War II ended in 1945. And that outcome of that war matters to the United States. For more than 7 decades, American leaders have said that a stable and secure Europe is a vital American national security interest. And how this war turns out is going to decide whether or not we have a stable and secure Europe, or we have an unstable and insecure Europe. Now, let me note, the war did not begin in 2022. The war began in 2014. After the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, he signed a settlement. And then he just disappeared, literally just vanished. 10 days later, he turned up in Russia. The next day, the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, appointed an acting president and an acting prime minister, and they said, our #1 foreign policy goal is to bring Ukraine closer to Europe. We're going to sign an association agreement with the European Union. That caused panic in Moscow. The Russians seized Crimea in February and March 2014. In mid-March, they illegally annexed Crimea. And a month later, Russian security and military forces became involved in fighting in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. So that by the end of 2014, about 40% of Donbass was either occupied by Russian or occupied by Russian proxy forces. Between 2014 and 2022, that conflict in Donbass never really ended. About 12,000 Ukrainians died in fighting along the line of contact there. And then you had 2022. I would say that there are 3 primary reasons that explain Russia's decision to launch the invasion, really Vladimir Putin's decision to launch the invasion in February of 2022. One was the Kremlin was becoming very concerned that Ukraine was moving out of Moscow's orbit towards the West, quite possibly irretrievably. That was true. But the irony here is that nothing has done more in the last 12 years to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West than Russian policy. The second factor was domestic politics inside of Russia. And that is for the Kremlin. A stable, democratic, successful Ukraine is a nightmare. Because that kind of Ukraine will cause the Russian people to ask, why can't they have the same political voice, the same democratic rights that Ukrainians have? And for the Kremlin, job #1 is regime preservation. But the third reason, and I think this is by far the most important reason, is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin fundamentally does not accept the right of Ukraine to exist as a sovereign and independent state. In 2021, he published a 6,000-word article explaining that. He looks at Ukraine as historic Russian land. So in June of 2022, about 4 months after the invasion, Putin was in St. Petersburg. he met with a group of Russian business students, and one of the students says, you know, Peter the Great conquered the Baltic states. And Putin says, no. Peter the Great did not conquer the Baltic states. He recovered historic Russian land. Putin then went on to compare himself to Peter the Great and say that what I'm doing in Ukraine is recovering historic Russian land. I don't think this war would have happened with any other Russian leader. Now, if you go back to February 2022 and you look at the Russian assault vectors, it suggests that the Russian army had two objectives. One was to take Kyiv at the outset and presumably depose the Ukrainian government. But the second factor was when you look at they were attacking from Belarus in the north, from Russia proper in the northeast, from occupied Donbass in the east, and from occupied Crimea in the south. The objective, I think, was to occupy the eastern one-half to two-thirds of Ukraine. And they failed. To the surprise of everyone, including me. I mean, had you asked me on February 25, I would have told you I expect within a couple of months the Russians will win the force-on-force fight, but Ukrainians will not give up. Russia will be faced with a decades-long bloody insurgency. But in fact, the Ukrainian military held, and the war now really is involved into one of attrition. If you had to say, well, who's winning? I would guess in 2024, I'd say, well, the Russians had a bit of momentum. They now occupy about 18% of Ukraine. And that's, well, first of all, that's a lot less than they occupied in 2022. They actually had to withdraw from the northern part of Ukraine after they failed to take Kyiv. And over the course of 2024, they captured about 1,500 square miles of Ukraine. In perspective, that's less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. And to gain that less than 1% of Ukrainian territory, the Russians paid a huge price. By some estimates, losing 1,700 to 2,000 soldiers a day killed and wounded in action. The British Ministry of Defense estimate now is that more than 800,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. The IISS, the think tank in London, believes about 180,000 of that 800,000 were killed in action. And just for some perspective, in January 2022, the active duty strength of the Russian military, not the army, the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, all branches, was 1.1 million. 800,000 casualties against that. Ukraine, I think, faces a difficult situation. I'm not going to say that Ukraine is winning. They have manpower issues. They also are very dependent on the West, including the United States, for arms and ammunition. There are, I believe, still weapons in the pipeline. The Biden administration apparently sent quite a bit of stuff in 2024 to Ukraine with the idea of allowing them to continue to fight at some point in 2025. We don't know what's going to happen with the future American assistance. But the Ukrainians are determined. They see this fight as existential. If they lose, Ukraine as they know it is gone. And my guess is that even if American assistance ends, the Ukrainians may be prepared to fight on. Now the focus now of the last couple weeks has been on negotiations. Negotiations, if and when they happen, are going to be extraordinarily complex. Because the Russian position is here, the Ukrainian position is there. There is no overlap. Vladimir Putin back in February of 22 laid out a series of demands that really would have amounted to the capitulation of Ukraine. One was denazification. That's a Russian term for removal of a government headed by a Jewish president. Another term was demilitarization. The Russians were saying, well, the Ukrainians can have an army of 50 to 85,000. Neutrality by Ukraine. They demanded that Ukraine recognize Crimea as Russian, and they demanded that Ukraine recognize Donbass as a so-called People's Republic. What's happened in the last few years since then is even when the Russians were losing on the battlefield, the Russians hardened their demands, which would not seem from Moscow as anything like a serious approach. Putin is prepared to negotiate on his terms, but nothing else thus far. On the other side, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has his own position. His position is complete withdrawal by the Russian army, going back to Ukraine's borders prior to 2014. Compensation, the amount of damage done in Ukraine to infrastructure. Okay. How about now? Let me come out a little bit further, because it's hard to hold the microphone. Zelensky wants compensation. The estimate is that something like between $500 and $800 billion of damage done to Ukrainian infrastructure, housing, and industry. And he also wants accountability. He wants war criminals brought to justice. And there are Russian war criminals. There have been significant war crimes committed inside of Ukraine. That's going to be hard because one of the war criminals is Vladimir Putin. The International Criminal Court has indicted him for war crimes because Russia has removed Ukrainian children and taken them back to Russia. Now, Zelensky did show, though, a bit of flexibility at the end of last year. He said he would be prepared to agree that Ukraine will not use military force to regain territory. They'll use diplomatic means, provided that Ukraine is in NATO. That's going to be a difficult issue, but at least he's beginning to show a little bit of flexibility, which you've not seen from the Russians. Now, before leaving the question here, I think we have to ask, what happens if Russia wins in Ukraine? I think that means Vladimir Putin will be emboldened, and if he has some time to regenerate his military, then I believe he poses a greater threat. And I do not think that Putin's ambitions end with Ukraine. Let me talk a bit about Putin and NATO. I don't think Putin, first of all, Putin clearly does not like NATO. I don't think he believes or fears an attack by NATO. And the evidence I would offer is the Kola Peninsula in northwest Russia, probably some of the most valuable military real estate in the country. It's the house to houses ballistic missile submarines, strategic bombers, nuclear weapons, the Russian. Well, the Finns and the Norwegians who border the Kola Peninsula say that in the last 2 years, the Russians have removed about 80% of their military forces along that border. That doesn't suggest Putin worries about a military attack. But what he does not like about NATO is that NATO is a constraint on his ambition to reassert Russian influence and Russian physical control in the post-Soviet space and also in Eastern Europe. Now, I think also Putin talks about this, and even after his phone call with President Trump 10 days ago, he said, well, we can't talk just about the settling the war in Ukraine. We have to talk about root causes. And what I think Putin is hoping to use is those settlement talks really to try to undo some of the security developments of the last 30 years in terms of, for example, pushing back NATO infrastructure. Would Vladimir Putin challenge a NATO state? I think that's an interesting question. Again, if Putin's looking at historic territory, if you look at a map of Russia, the Russian Empire at the end of the 18th century, you're going to see that most of Poland, the 3 Baltic states, and Finland, that's now 5 NATO members, were part of the Russian Empire. Does he regard those as historic Russian territory? Now, if you were to ask experts now, would Putin really attack a NATO country like, say, Eastern Estonia? I think most experts say, well, no, that would be crazy, and they're probably right. But, had you asked those same experts in 2020, is Putin going to attack Ukraine in the way that he did in 2022? They would likely have said, no, he won't do that. That would be crazy. We underestimate Putin's ambitions at our peril. And this is somebody who also shows that he can make significant miscalculations. By most appearances, Putin and the Russians thought they would win this war in February 22 in a matter of weeks. The Ukrainians report that one of the Russian convoys that they shot up, they found a truck. It wasn't full of food for the Russian soldiers or gasoline or ammunition. It was full of brand new dress uniforms for the victory parade that they thought they were going to be staging in Kyiv. So again, I look at this. I worry about what Putin might do after Ukraine. And again, I think a Russian victory in Ukraine means a less stable, less secure Europe. Let me talk a bit about the nuclear challenges that Russia poses. And we've seen over the last few years Russia using nuclear threats. Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, but they've tried to use these threats, one, to persuade the Ukrainians to stop fighting, and they've tried to persuade the West not to arm Ukraine. I think they've had a bit of success with the West in that they haven't stopped decisions by the West, but they've made some of those decisions take much longer. So decisions that could have been taken in 3 or 4 weeks For example, to give the Ukrainians F-16s and training took 5 or 6 months. But there was a time in September of 2022 where there was real concern in the U.S. government. In fact, I'm told that there was an assessment in the U.S. government in September 2022 that there was a 50% chance that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine. It didn't happen. I think it didn't happen because the Russians saw the threat was not changing attitudes in Ukraine. It was not stopping the West from providing weapons to the Ukrainians. In fact, also Washington, Paris, and London, the 3 NATO nuclear powers, apparently sent some fairly sharp messages privately to the Russians. But also, we're hearing now the Chinese, the Indians, other countries in the global south with the Russians and said, you can't do that. That's not acceptable. And what was then interesting is at the end of October 2022, you can go and you can see Moscow ratcheting down the nuclear rhetoric, including Putin. There was a little bit of a concern in the fall of this last year that the Russians might again try to play the nuclear card. But they basically came out and they altered their nuclear declaratory policy. Russian nuclear policy on nuclear weapons used to be really clear. They said, we will use nuclear weapons in 2 conditions. 1, if there's an attack with nuclear weapons or another weapon of mass destruction on Russia or on a Russian ally, we will use nuclear weapons. The other condition is if there is a conventional assault on Russia that puts the existence of the Russian state at stake, we will then use nuclear weapons. From my perspective, those are clear, those are understandable, and they are very credible. What's happened over recent years, but particularly last fall, is the Russians tried to fuzz it because they wanted to make the West think, well, they might be more likely to use nuclear weapons. So now the criterion on a conventional assault is not it puts the existence of the state at stake. It is, well, it endangers Russian territory or Russian sovereignty. What does that mean? Again, I think it was mainly bluff. You've seen over the last 7 months, Ukraine actually occupies part of Russia. Ukraine has been conducting drone strikes at deeper ranges into Russia, and the Russians have not responded. And it's led me to conclude that the Russians don't want, and Putin does not want to use nuclear weapons. He wants us, though, to believe that he's prepared to do it. And I think there are a couple reasons why he won't. First of all, Putin seems to be accepting of the fact that he's ostracized in the West, except now apparently for President Trump. But if he were to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, I think he would find himself as a global pariah. The global South, India, and maybe even China, I think, would turn against that. But there's a second factor that I think deters Putin, in that once you use a nuclear weapon, bear in mind, nuclear weapons have not been used in war for 80 years. Once you do that, the rules change. And you've opened up a Pandora's box, and the consequences are unpredictable, they're nasty, and they're catastrophic, potentially, including for Russia. So again, I tend to be less concerned about the Russian threats. Where I see the challenge on the nuclear side, though, is the collapse of the arms control regime of the last 40, 50 years, and a nuclear arms race. So we're now in a situation where, after a lot of progress in the 80s and the 90s, we're down to one treaty that governs the United States and Russia in the nuclear area. And for a long time, going back to the 60s, Washington and Moscow said, look, even if we have bad relations, we have a shared interest in constraining the nuclear part of our competition. We now have one agreement. It's the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty. I refer to it as New START. And that reduced American and Russian strategic nuclear weapons, deployed weapons, down to the lowest levels really since the 1960s. The problem was in 2023, Vladimir Putin, because of his unhappiness with U.S. support for Ukraine, basically said, we, Russia, will observe the numerical limits of the treaty, but we are going to suspend the data exchanges, the notifications, the on-site inspections that will allow you Americans to verify that we are observing those limits. And then 3 months later, the United States said, well, if you're not going to do the verification measures, neither will we. Now, this all becomes a little bit overtaken by events in less than a year, because the treaty will expire in February 2026, at which point there would no longer be any limits on US and Russian nuclear weapons for the first time in decades. Now, it was interesting, about 2 weeks ago, President Trump did make some comments about nuclear weapons are very expensive, he would like to denuclearize with Russia and China. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Vladimir Putin 3 days ago said, well, maybe we can do something after the New START treaty. But if the sides actually do get to a point where resuming conversations, that would be a positive. But there's still going to be really challenging issues for them to deal with. One is the Trump administration, in its first term, really wanted to bring China in. And China actually is the country now that is doing a fairly major nuclear buildup. But China's been adamant, we're not going to talk to the United States and Russia about nuclear arms because we're still way below their levels. The Russians say, well, wait a minute, we also want the British and the French in. And I don't know how you do that five-way negotiation because presumably all 5 countries are going to want equality, but the numbers are so disparate. And we're not going to be able, I think, to do something like the Washington Naval Treaty of 1923, which actually set different limits for different countries. Once you actually, if you get to the table, they're going to be hard questions. I believe that the Trump administration would like to focus on reducing nuclear arms. That's a good thing. I think we should be doing that. But I think they're also going to face difficult issues from the Russians, and if we can get to the table, the Chinese. The Russians and Chinese want to talk about American long-range conventional strike capabilities. Because some of the American systems are now so accurate, they can attack and destroy targets that we used to plan a nuclear weapon hit. There's also the question of missile defense, which seems to be a perennial issue on the part of the Russians. But the Russians have said, going back to 2011, we're not prepared to reduce nuclear weapons unless you Americans are prepared to put constraints on missile defense. Well, you may have seen that President Trump is now talking about Iron Dome, which I think would be an impossibly achievable. It's just, Israel has an Iron Dome because they're accepting rockets that go 15 miles in range. We're talking about an Iron Dome that will intercept missiles that go 8,000 miles in range, and it's vastly more difficult. But if you go back to the Trump administration's first term and you read their missile defense review, it says there shall be no limits on missile defense. So even if we get to the table, it's going to be a really different negotiation with hard resolved questions. And I think, unfortunately, we are now entering into a 3-way nuclear arms race with Russia and China. Where in Washington, people now are talking about the limits that were in the New START Treaty. Those are now too constraining for American needs because we have to worry about both Russia and China. Now, my own hope is that before we go too far down this path, that we recall the lessons that we learned back in the 1960s that led to the first negotiations between Washington and Moscow. And the main lesson was, if I'm building up more nuclear weapons, and so are you, my nuclear weapons increase is not buying me net security. There's a rationale there for arms control. Another challenge that we face with Russia is this Russia, China, North Korea, Iran axis that some see. I tend to think that we shouldn't overstate that axis. I mean, these are 4 countries with very disparate interests, but they come together on one issue, is all 4 would like to see a reduction in American power and influence. But there are certain limitations. So the main player in that axis would be Russia and China. And literally about 2 weeks before the Russian invasion in February of 2022, Putin met with President Xi of China, and they announced, we have a partnership without limits. Well, what we've seen in the last few years is actually that there are some limits. So one of the Western sanctions that was applied against Russia after the invasion was Western financial institutions are no longer allowed to make loans to Russian entities. What we have not seen is Chinese banks rushing in to fill the vacuum. And that reflects in part the Chinese banks worried that if they did that, they might be subject to secondary sanctions from the West. You also have, while China has been helping the Russian defense industrial base, we've not seen the Chinese doing what North Korea is. China does not seem to be sending weapons to the Russians. And there's some limitations there, and I think they're explained by the fact that China has its own interests that it's pursuing. And while China's economic relationship with Russia now is about $200 billion a year, That's pretty small compared to its relationship with the United States at $600 billion a year, or its relationship with Europe at $600 billion a year. And that's real money. And the Chinese do not want to endanger that or get that subject to sanctions. And that, I think, restrains the Chinese from doing too much to help the Russians. Although I think Xi likes what Putin is doing because he sees it as a distraction for the United States and Europe and maybe taking away some of our attention from China. You have the Russia-North Korea relationship, which is basically based on the North Korean readiness 2 years ago to provide weapons when the Russians began to run out of things like artillery shells. And then the Russians have provided about 12,000 troops, which actually went into battle on the Russian side at the end of last year. Although the Ukrainians report that they have not seen those troops now in the firefights for about a month. And the assessment is that the North Koreans lost somewhere between 30 and 50% of their manpower in about 2 months of fighting and have now left the field. You have a relationship between Russia and Iran, but again, it has limitations as well. Over the last 5 years, Russia has wanted to build a relationship with Saudi Arabia and the other Persian Gulf states. They don't see Iran as an adversary, and that really constrains Russia's ability to go too far with Iran if it wants to keep those relations developing with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and such. Elsewhere in the Middle East, last year was not a good year for Russian interests. Assad was routed. You may recall that back in 2015, the Russian military deployed to Syria on Assad's behalf, particularly the Russian Air Force. What we've seen now is the Russians have withdrawn all of their ground equipment. Tartus, which was a port that the Russians used as a naval base on the Mediterranean, has been empty of Russian ships now for about 3 months. And the belief is that the Syrians are not prepared to allow the Russian Navy to return there. So it's been a mixed bag for the Russians in the Middle East. Let me talk about one other challenge, which we call hybrid warfare. And this is warfare that's a notch below what we think about. And when we think about warfare, it's troops going head to head. Hybrid warfare tends to have some other elements. One is disinformation, and we see a lot of Russian efforts at disinformation targeting the United States. This isn't new. 45 years ago, we used to call this Soviet active measures, one of which in the 1980s was the Russians found a small leftist newspaper in Italy, and they had paid that newspaper to print a story that said HIV/AIDS is the result of an American bioweapons program which broke out of a laboratory. And that got some coverage. Today with social media, the Russians don't have to go to a newspaper anywhere. They have one of their trolls put the story out, it's then amplified by Russian bots, and all of a sudden it's all across Twitter or whatever. And it's something that we're going to have to figure out a better way to deal with. It's a challenge. Another part of hybrid warfare is sabotage. There are now credible reports of warehouses, factories in Europe that are providing defense material to Ukraine. Fires suspiciously set. We've also seen reports, you might have seen in the news, about ships transiting the Baltic. Somehow their anchors get dropped, dragged along the sea bottom, and they sever cables. So the Finns in the end of December seized a ship called the Eagle S, and they believe that it dropped its anchor purposely to sever a cable that took electricity between Finland and Estonia, and also severed 2 fiber optics cables. So these are hybrid warfare that, again, I think NATO, for example, it knows what to do if there's an airstrike on a NATO country, but we're not having yet a good strategy for dealing with those hybrid warfare elements. So those are some of the challenges. Let me talk a little bit about the U.S. policy response. And let me start about saying what I think the policy response should be. These are notes I wrote up at the beginning of January thinking, gee, if somebody from the Trump administration or the incoming administration ever were to ask me, what advice would I give them in my areas of expertise? And this would have been my advice. First of all, the United States is going to have to spend more money than we would like on defense. But we ought to do it smart. And I worry a little bit that the Pentagon now, because of the Chinese nuclear buildup, is thinking we need to do more nuclear weapons. And I worry that that will take money away from conventional weapons. And I think that would be a mistake. And the reason is, it seems to me that the most plausible and perhaps the only really logical path I can see either to a US-Russia or a US-Chinese nuclear conflict is going to be a conventional conflict. And that conflict goes bad, and then one side of there chooses to escalate to nuclear weapons. I would like to see the United States maintain conventional force capabilities along with our allies that could deter that conventional conflict in the first place. Because if we prevent that conflict out from breaking out, I think we avert the major, sometimes hard to deal with. They can be frustrating, but they provide basis for forward placing your troops. In some areas, they provide troops to help you, and their political support provides you legitimacy for military operations that you might not otherwise have. Now, at the same time, I think we need, particularly with the European allies, to persuade them they need to be spending more. Most allies now have hit the goal that was set for last year of 2% of gross domestic product. There's a conversation now in Europe that says, no, it's got to be more like 3 to 3.5%. We have to do more, but again, we want allies. They really are on our side. Other advice would be, do not try to drive wedges between Russia and China. We're not smart enough to do that, and we might well push them even closer together. But I can see opportunities where tension might develop naturally. The Chinese, I believe, are not too thrilled about how the North Koreans have turned to Russia. China talks about itself as an Arctic power, and if you look at the map, that's kind of a head scratcher. I don't think that makes the Russians comfortable. Over the last 25 years, China has invested through the Belt and Road Initiative and other projects a lot of money in Central Asia. Pipelines, railways, things like that. At some point, it would be logical for the Chinese to try to turn that economic investment into political influence, and that'll be a source of tension with Moscow. But we gotta let that develop on its own. I would also say we should be ready to engage on nuclear questions, things like that, because despite a difficult relationship, containing the nuclear competition remains in our interest. And this should be a long-term strategy. We should understand that the relationship between the United States and Russia and between the West and Russia is going to remain fundamentally adversarial for some time to come. Now, the good news is we've done this before. We did this for 40 years in the Cold War, and we found a combination of deterrence and containment and negotiation when opportunities arose to successfully manage that. Now, those are the recommendations I would have given to the incoming Trump administration in early January of 2025. As I said, I'm not sure they would follow them. After the last 2 weeks, I am absolutely certain they would not follow them. And I have to say, I'm extremely distressed by what we've seen in 2 weeks. First of all, you may have seen 3 days ago, the announcement by the Department of Defense. Their plan is to cut American defense spending by 8% per year for the next 5 years. And I scratched my head. If you look at what the Russians are doing, you look at what the Chinese are doing, I would like to save money, but I don't think defense is the place to do it. And then they've said, well, they're going to preserve the money for nuclear arms. They're going to preserve money for missile defense. So it looks to me, where are the bulk of those cuts going to come out of? The conventional forces that we need to deter a conventional fight. I think that is more likely to increase the risk of nuclear war. Also, if we want allies to increase their defense spending, it's going to be awfully hard to go to the Europeans and say, you should be spending 3% instead of 2% when we're making a significant cut in our spending. I think we've created a situation where NATO allies now wonder, can they count on the United States? And here's where I worry that President Trump doesn't really understand the value of alliances and what they can provide. He seems to see them mostly in money terms. They're not spending enough. But let me point out, in NATO's 76 years, Article 5 is the heart of NATO. It says allies will consider an attack on one an attack against all. In 76 years, NATO has invoked Article 5 only one time. That was in 2001 in defense of the United States. We lost 2,400 service personnel in Afghanistan, but what doesn't get a lot of attention here is 1,000 NATO soldiers also died in Afghanistan. They were only there because they were American allies. If we weaken NATO, we are going to diminish our own security. Also, I am not sure that President Trump sees the challenge, the threat posed by Russia. He seems to have this very inexplicable affinity for Vladimir Putin. And I think in the last 10 days, we have seen him take steps that are going to be counterproductive. This unseemly eagerness to engage Putin, agreement on concessions or making concessions already in the Russia-Ukraine talks, I'll come back to in a moment. The eagerness to meet. Western leaders for 3 years have said, you'll not meet Putin. That's part of the idea to ostracize him. Well, President Trump has agreed to meet him not once, but several times. President Trump calling for the G7 to bring Russia back into the G8. If you took a vote today, U.S. would lose 1-6 on that. And then this first major engagement on trying to broker any war is not with Ukraine, but Secretary Rubio is in Saudi Arabia meeting with the Russians. On the Russian scorecard, that's 4 wins for Russia. And I look over the last 10 days, and I do not see a single thing that the United States received in return. Moreover, Vladimir Putin is going to look at that and say, this guy is weak. Vladimir Putin is not going to respond with more concessions. But Putin's going to sit back and say, if I've got him going this way, I'm just going to sit back and wait for more concessions. So that's going to make it harder for the president to achieve what he says he would like to achieve. Now, President Trump has said he's attaching priority to resolve the war between Russia and Ukraine. But again, I think in the last 10 days, that brokering effort has gotten off to a very bad start. So, for example, 11 days ago in Europe, Secretary Hegseth, and then it was repeated by President Trump a day later, says, look, Ukraine can't recover all of its territory, and it's unrealistic for Ukraine to expect to join NATO. Now, that could be true, but if you're a senior official for the United States where you're trying to broker a solution between Russia and Ukraine, why do you step off basically leaning towards the Russian side, making concessions to the Russians? That makes no sense. I also don't disagree with the sequence of meetings. I would argue the first meeting should have been with Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Ukraine is a partner, Russia's an adversary. Ukraine is a victim, although I was stunned to see, and he said it not once but twice, last week President Trump said that it was Ukraine that attacked Russia. That is just a bizarre world that is very different from what I lived through 3 years ago. But after meeting first with Ukraine and getting a sense of where Ukraine had some flexibility and where it might not have flexibility, then the second time people to talk with were key European leaders. Because the administration's plan apparently wants Europe to put either peacekeeping forces or security forces in Ukraine with no U.S. contribution. That's a hard ask to make. Now, happily, some European countries are thinking about saying, maybe we could do this. But you should talk to them first. And this original idea that they're not going to be involved in the negotiations, we want them to play an important role in implementing the settlement, but we're not going to have them at the table. That's not going to play well, and it decreases the likelihood that the Europeans will do what we would like. Then third, before you sit down with Vladimir Putin, you need to build some negotiating leverage with him. The United States already has tons of leverage with Ukraine. We're their biggest political supporter, we're their biggest provider of military assistance, although, contrary to what the President says, in fact, Europe has provided more assistance when you count financial and economic aid. But build some leverage with Putin, and you could do that. You could tighten Western sanctions. You could go to the G7 and say, we've frozen $300 billion in Russian central bank assets. Let's just seize them. Put them into a fund and transfer that money to Ukraine. He could go to Congress and ask for more money for military assistance to Ukraine. And all of those things would have confronted Putin with the reality that if he does not negotiate seriously and try to end this war, the war will continue, and the military, economic, and political costs for Putin and Russia will increase. You give him an incentive to negotiate, and Trump has done none of that. Again, I look at the way he's jumped out with Russia over the last 10 days, and reading what I see from European reporting, we've led to lots of concern in Kyiv. We have promoted consternation in most European capitals. In Moscow, there's jubilation. And you can watch us on Russian television each night. These guys are popping the champagne corks. They think Christmas has arrived with the Trump presidency. So my final observation, I look at this and I'm trying to figure out, is this incompetence, rookie mistakes, as Senator Wicker of Mississippi said, or is this by design? Some believe this is by design, and I have to confess I'm in that direction. And their belief is that there is a strategy in the Trump administration of throw Ukraine under the bus, maybe throw Europe under the bus as well, and that will help us build leverage and help us cultivate Putin. and then we can somehow cleverly pull Putin away from China, and that positions us then to deal with China because we won't have a relationship with Russia. If that's the strategy, they grossly misunderstand the relationship between Xi and Putin and between Russia and China. Putin is absolutely dependent on China. Putin is not going to throw over Xi and China to making a bet on an American president who may not be around in 2028. So if they're driving that strategy, and the outcome would be of that, if they pursue that, is if we move away from Europe, we're going to find ourselves facing a China still supported by the Russians, and the Europeans at that point will be so preoccupied with Russia, they're not going to be prepared to help us vis-a-vis China. So America first in this case is going to be America alone. That's not a place to be. So I find myself saying, I very much hope this is not designed, that this is incompetence. If it's designed, we're likely to see steps that will diminish America's role and influence in the world. It will diminish American security. And it will be a danger to significant American interests. If it's incompetence, at least it's risky, but there's a chance it can be fixed. So I'm hoping for incompetence over design. But I have to say, and I end this on a downer note, I have either practiced foreign policy or closely followed it now for more than 45 years. I would say that the last 2 weeks, I have never seen a period where I've been more dismayed, embarrassed, appalled, or disgusted by American foreign policy. And I wish I did not have to say that. So I apologize for the downer, but it'd be